It began on a night so quiet the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The apartment was steeped in half-light, the kind that blurs corners and softens resolve. The only sound was the hum of the city below, distant and low, like a pulse I couldn't quite ignore. I sat at my drafting table, blueprints spread before me, the neat geometry of my life laid out in ruler straight lines. Yet my focus kept slipping from the plans to the faint scent on my sleeve, turpentine and citrus, the smell that always clung to her. The lamp threw a single golden pool across the paper, and within that circle of light everything looked organized, rational, contained. But just beyond it, in the hush between heartbeats, chaos waited. Her memory lived there. The way she laughed too loudly in small spaces. The way her hair caught the light when she bent over a canvas. The way she looked at me as if I were something she was still learning how to draw. I'd spent months pretending that what bound us was friendship, shared art projects, creative debates, laughter stretched late into the night. It was a convenient lie, one that fit neatly within the architecture of my family's expectations. My parents believed I was steady, practical, heading toward a predictable future with a man who worked alongside me in the firm. They saw my life as something designed, safe, measured, symmetrical. But Shelina was asymmetry made flesh, a disruption that felt like freedom. When I first met her at the gallery downtown, she was arguing with a curator about color temperature, waving her hands in exasperated grace. I had been there on behalf of a client, armed with spreadsheets and budgets, yet I couldn't look away from her. She had paint beneath her nails and a smudge of charcoal on her jaw, and I remember thinking she looked more alive than anyone I'd ever met. She noticed me watching, smiled as if she knew exactly what she was doing, and in that single glance something in me bent toward her. Since then, she had become a constant hum beneath the surface of my ordered existence. Coffee dates disguised as brainstorming sessions. Shared silences that said more than words ever could. The gentle brush of her hand when she leaned over to show me a sketch, accidental, she'd claim, though neither of us believed it. Every encounter rewrote the laws I'd lived by, until my family's world began to feel like a museum exhibit, admired, but no longer inhabited. That evening, the tension had become unbearable. I sat beneath the soft glare of my lamp, staring at my phone, her last message glowing on the screen, thinking of you while I paint. Nothing more, yet everything. My throat tightened. I imagined her in her studio, hair tied loosely, skin kissed with light from the tall windows, her brush moving with that instinctive rhythm I envied. I could see the streaks of color across her arms, the faint sway of her body to music only she could hear. The clock ticked. My chest ached with the quiet violence of wanting. The walls felt too close, the air too still. I pushed my chair back, the sound loud in the silence, and stood. My reflection caught in the glass of the framed family photo on my shelf. My parents smiling, my brother beside them, the life they expected of me reflected in miniature. Their love was real, but it came with conditions disguised as blessings. I touched the glass once, then turned it face down. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, its grid of lights stretching endlessly, every one a promise someone had kept or broken. Somewhere out there, she was awake. The thought of her felt like heat under my skin, a current traveling upward, pulling me from the version of myself I no longer wished to inhabit. For so long I'd told myself that loving her would destroy everything, my family's trust, my reputation, the illusion of certainty. But what I hadn't considered was that not loving her was destroying me in quieter ways. 1,000 small denials, each one erasing a part of who I was becoming. I crossed the room to the closet, pulled a small overnight bag from the shelf, and began to pack. Not hurriedly, but with the calm precision of someone finally obeying a truth too long ignored. A change of clothes, my sketchbook, a sweater she once complimented. I hesitated over my mother's bracelet lying on the dresser, a family heirloom, then left it there. I wanted no talismans from the life I was leaving behind. When I opened the door, the hallway light spilled in, cool and sterile, illuminating the fine dust motes drifting in the air. Each one shimmered briefly before vanishing like moments, like fears. My footsteps echoed down the corridor, and with each step, the weight in my chest loosened. The elevator doors opened with a sigh, and I caught my reflection again in the mirrored wall, a woman on the verge of honesty. Outside, the city was alive in ways the night never was in my parents' home, neon signs buzzing, laughter spilling from late cafes, the smell of espresso and possibility hanging in the air. I hailed a cab and gave her address before I could second-guess myself. As the car threaded through the narrow streets, I watched the reflections flicker across the window, shop lights, passing headlights, flashes of strangers' faces. My pulse slowed, settling into the rhythm of decision. I thought of her hands, of the way she'd once brushed a stray curl behind my ear during a shared lunch, fingers lingering just long enough to make me forget how to breathe. I thought of the warmth that spread through me then, quiet and vast, a promise wrapped in restraint. The cab stopped outside her building, a converted warehouse that smelled faintly of wood and paint and something indefinably hers. The lobby light buzzed faintly overhead as I pressed the call button for her floor. My hand trembled, not from fear but from recognition, that I was standing at the intersection of every path I had refused to take. When the elevator doors slid open, I stepped into a corridor washed in soft amber light. The air carried traces of linseed oil and coffee. At the far end, her studio door was ajar, light spilling through the crack in muted golds and pinks, the colors of late-night creation. I hesitated for a heartbeat, aware that beyond that door waited a choice that could not be undone. But even hesitation was a kind of lie. My body was already moving, drawn by something older and truer than obligation. My hand reached for the door, fingertips brushing its worn edge. The scent of her paint, skin, something floral, drifted toward me. In that moment, I realized the truth I had been circling for months. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet turning of a handle in the middle of the night, the steady breath of someone finally stepping into her own light. The door creaked softly as it opened wider. I didn't yet see her, but I felt the shift, the air thickening with familiarity, the weight of everything unsaid pressing against my ribs. My heart beat once, twice, then settled into something steady, something sure. I crossed the threshold, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't leaving something behind. I was walking toward it. Her studio met me like a soft exhale, the kind of welcome that loosens a spine before a mind agrees to relax. Light pooled across the concrete floor in warm rectangles, catching on jars and brushes and the shining rims of paint-tubed halos. The air tasted faintly of linseed oil and citrus cleaner, a scent I had come to associate with her presence even when she wasn't there, as if the room kept a memory of her on purpose. I stepped inside with the quiet reverence of someone entering a chapel built from work and wanting, and the doors settled behind me with a hush that sounded like permission. I stood still, letting my senses catch up to the decision my feet had already made, and felt the first layer of fear slide away like an old shirt shrugged to the floor. She had left traces of herself in every direction. A cotton sweater hung on the back of a chair with its sleeves twisted together like held hands. A ceramic cup rested on a low cart, lipstick printed on its rim like a soft red thumbprint. A half-finished canvas leaned against the far wall, its center a bloom of crimson winding into cobalt, the colors kissing and pulling apart in a rhythm that felt uncomfortably familiar. I could read her process in the spatter on the drop cloths and the order of pigments laid out like small songs. The longer I stood there, the more I recognized the grammar of her life, impulse tethered to discipline, chaos framed by devotion, mess revered as evidence. I wanted to be read that way too. I crossed to the long table that served as her workbench and touched the edge, feeling the scarred wood warm beneath my palm. My fingertips found a nick and paused there, the imperfection catching skin the way her attention caught me in rooms where I wished to remain invisible. I imagined her leaning here earlier, hip against the table, wrist turning in small circles to coax a stubborn blend, lower lip caught between teeth as if it might keep the color from breaking too soon. A smile tugged my mouth before I noticed it, my body knowing her body's habits more fluently than I had allowed myself to admit. I slid my hand along the grain until it reached the little bowl of jewelry she abandoned when paint demanded both hands. Rings, thin bracelets, a tiny chain. I lifted the chain and let it spill over my fingers like a bright confession, then placed it back as carefully as if it were sleeping. I realized then that love had been learning my name in the small ways I took inventory of her every day, how I counted the breaths that followed the furrowing of her brow, how I anticipated the moment a brush would be snapped clean and set aside, how I knew where she would stand to study a canvas from 3 paces and where from 10. The precision comforted me, a fellow architect's pleasure in structure, and also terrified me, because once you know a pattern by heart, breaking it requires more courage than learning it ever did. I moved through the studio like a tide coming in, slow and intent, and my own reflection surprised me in the beveled glass of a framed print hanging near the sink. The woman looking back stood taller than I remembered, as if choice added inches. My hair had escaped its careful clip and curled at my neck. A strand clung to my collarbone, damp from the heat of the walk and the rhythm of my breath. I watched myself tuck it behind my ear, watched the angle of my jaw harden into resolve, watched the softening that followed, because resolve without softness had always made me cruel to myself. I did not want to be cruel anymore. On a low shelf, I found her sketchbooks stacked neatly, spines labeled with months and years in her looping hand. My fingers hovered above them, aware that opening one would be an intimacy deeper than the brush of skin, would be an admission that I wanted all her rough drafts, not only the finished work she chose for the world. I selected a book at random and set it on the table, the paper's weight a pleasant gravity in my hands. When I lifted the cover, a citrus tang rose, graphite and gum eraser, and a faint suggestion of the oranges she ate over the sink. The first page was a wash of lines too quick to resolve into subject, but the energy pulsed. The second page caught at my chest, a study of hands that were not exactly mine and yet belonged to me in the vocabulary of gesture, long fingers, a small scar near the base of the thumb from a childhood fall I rarely remembered. She had drawn the scar. She had noticed the way my fingers taper, the way my knuckles sit like punctuation in a sentence that doesn't want to end. The drawing was not precious, it was practice. The fact that she practiced me steadied and shook me at once. I closed the book with tenderness and placed it back where it had been, aligning its spine precisely with the others, as if that small order would prove I deserved the disorder I craved. I crossed to the couch tucked into the studio's quiet corner, a battered leather piece softened by use, a throw blanket tossed carelessly over the arm. I sat and let the support of it meet me fully, my back settling into a shape that only this couch could require. I thought of the many forms comfort takes, a shoulder found in a crowded room, a text at midnight saying I am awake too, a glass of water set near a hand that doesn't know it's thirsty yet. I had learned comfort as duty in my family's house, bring the casserole, answer the call, hold the peace. What I wanted now was comfort as recognition. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, letting sensation lead memory where narrative could not. I felt the weight of all the almosts between us, each one a warm coin in my pocket I had refused to spend. The time she pressed an extra sweater into my hands at a gallery opening because the space was colder than it looked and I had pretended not to notice my own shiver. The time I stood behind her at a small party, our bodies close because the room was narrow, and I could have placed my palm at the small of her back as a courtesy to pass, but instead I waited and let the closeness become its own quiet conversation. The time she reached for a jar on a high shelf and her shirt lifted just enough to reveal a crescent of skin, and I learned that wanting can be reverent and hungry at once. I did not hear the lightest sounds, that domestic chorus of keys set down, a shoe nudged aside, fabric whispering as an arm shrugged a jacket free, but I felt them. The studio shifted the way a body shifts when another person enters a room and everything recalibrates to make space. My skin knew before my mind did, the air becoming hers, the pulse of the place growing audible. I stayed where I was, eyes closed, because meeting someone's gaze at the threshold of a choice can make even steady feet turn back. I wanted to greet her with honesty, not performance. When presence reached the distance where presence becomes touch without contact, I opened my eyes. She stood a few paces away, hair escaping in soft rebellion from the loose shape she had wrangled it into, paint freckling one forearm in a constellation I did not recognize from the sketchbook. Her chest rose and fell in that slower cadence she acquires when she is not on display, and seeing her unarranged made something in me unclench. The corners of her mouth pressed into that almost smile I loved, the one that appeared before laughter and stayed after it left, as if joy were a habit she couldn't quite break. I lifted my hand, not in greeting, but in offering, palm open on my lap. She did not need invitation, she needed witness. She came to the couch and sank beside me, our thighs brushing in a connection that felt less like contact and more like the finishing of a sentence two minds had begun separately. The couch absorbed us as if it had been waiting. I angled toward her, my knee finding the outside of her leg, and let the sensation travel from skin to muscle to bone. The room clicked into its true alignment. The first kiss did not ask for fanfare. It arrived the way summer arrives in a room with poor blinds, quietly, all at once. Her mouth found mine with a certainty that felt like recognition rather than conquest, and I learned something new about the mechanics of breathing. The softness of her lips met the steadiness of mine, and then reversed, as if we agreed to trade qualities until both of us held both. Heat blossomed in that way heat does when it intends to inhabit a place, not just pass through, and my hands, obedient to currents older than language, rose to the slope of her shoulders. I felt the lived detail, a knot of tension under the left blade, the fine flutter of a pulse near the throat, the way her skin warmed a fraction faster than mine in the first moments of closeness. We broke only to measure distance again with a different instrument, foreheads touching, breath evening. I retaught myself her face at this proximity, the fleck of gold in her iris that catches light like a secret, the faint scar at her temple from a fall off a stool she had told me in a story I hadn't realized I'd kept. The second kiss lengthened, finding the line between patience and hunger we had both walked so long that our feet were tender. My right hand slid, respectfully curious, to the hem of her shirt. I paused there because pause is part of respect, then moved upward, fingers learning the geography I had dreamed and refused. Her back arched subtly, a reflex with its own alphabet, and when my palm found the place between her shoulder blades where tension nested, I pressed. The breath that left her chest told me I had written the right word. Desire did not rush us. It braided itself into the intimacy slowly, threading through the weave of yes and wait and more that our bodies spoke without speaking. I learned the curve at the base of her ribs that summoned an involuntary tremor, the place along her side where a lighter touch invited a deeper answer, the tilt of her chin that meant come back to my mouth now, not yet there. My own learning surprised me in its clarity. I had not expected my skin to be so articulate. When her hand traveled beneath the hem of my shirt and flattened against my spine, I felt old scaffolding loosen and fall, the quiet relief of no longer needing supports I had outgrown. We paused with intention, not reluctance, because endurance is a gift in firsts. I leaned back into the couch and drew her with me, arranging our bodies the way I arrange furniture when I want a room to encourage conversation. She settled half beside, half on me, a thigh draped over my legs, one arm tucked under my head, the other hand splayed on my abdomen in a claim that felt like caretaking. The weight of her grounded me, the closeness expanded me. I let my hand roam the slow, reverent paths along the curve of her hip, the line of her waist, the warm plane of her stomach, up to the undercurve of her breast where fabric softened the question into an answer. When her breath hitched at my cautious pressure, I felt the certainty that frightens and steadies at once. She had been waiting too. Time did what time does when bodies negotiate new truths. It changed shape. Minutes became thick with sensation, an elastic space where a single sigh could stretch to fill whole rooms. I sank through layers of myself, architect, daughter, woman who made sense by pleasing, and found a quieter self beneath, one who knew things by touch. When her fingers traced along my ribs and paused just where the muscle flares inward, my back arched without instruction, and I felt that whispered thought surface in my mind with the force of an answered prayer, right there. The hum that left my mouth surprised me with its lack of apology. I wanted more because the wanting itself finally felt clean. We took turns as if we had practiced a choreography alone and only now discovered the partner work it had needed all along. Her hand slipped under my shirt again, higher, slower, drawing careful lines that allowed my body to choose when to sharpen and when to soften. When she cupped me with the delicacy I had always believed was reserved for art, I felt a sting of tears that had nothing to do with sadness. She unspooled those tears with the heel of her palm and the patience of someone who knows that release can be the gentlest form of courage. My hand answered in kind, mapping her with a tension that felt like honesty, and when the rhythm we built found its own repetition, our breaths found each other and climbed in concert. We crested together, not like fireworks, but like tide, inevitable, strong. The whole body answering a call the mind had finally stopped refusing. After, we did not separate for a long while. I felt our heartbeats learn to share a tempo, the way musicians settling into the same measure find ease. She made small circles on the inside of my wrist with her thumb. The simplest intimacy turned into a vow. I rested my cheek against her hair and breathed the scent the room had been holding for me all along, and the safety that spread through me was so complete that I startled at its unfamiliarity. I had been loved before in ways that required shrinking. This felt like widening. We migrated eventually to the floor, the couch too narrow for the new language our bodies wanted to speak in sleep. She pulled a quilt from the back of a chair, a patchwork thing softened by many washings, and we laid it over the drop cloth as if blessing the space with a ceremony only we would remember. We lay on our sides facing each other, and the distance between our noses felt sacred. My palm found the curve of her waist and stayed there, claiming and calming. Her knee brushed mine and stilled, a metronome that had found its tempo. We spoke the bedside conversation without words fears announced in the tightening of a shoulder, soothed by a hand traveling the map. Hopes confessed in the way a chest lifts when a possibility is named in silence. Secrets offered up through the heat of a cheek pressed to a palm. I told her I was afraid of losing my place in my own family. She answered by curling my fingers around her wrist where her pulse danced, as if to say here is a place no one can evict you from. She told me she feared being someone's rebellion rather than someone's home. I answered by guiding her hand to my sternum and letting her feel the slowed, steady drum as if to say this is not a protest, this is an address. At some point, sleep braided itself into the conversation and drew us down. I woke once to find our legs completely tangled and did not untangle them. I woke again to feel the smallest kiss pressed where my jaw meets my ear a benediction and knew I had not imagined any of it. When morning found us, it did not announce itself through bricks of light or ringing alarms. It arrived as warmth gathered where two bodies had made heat together, as the sweet ache of muscles used for truth, as the startling ease of a smile before thought. I watched her stir and settle again and realized I had become the kind of woman who could watch and not reach for a mask. We rose into the day slowly, every movement part of an unlearning. I stood at her sink and washed my face with the bar soap she favored, a faint hint of eucalyptus lifting around me, and felt my skin inhabit me more fully. She stood behind me at a respectful distance, our eyes meeting in the mirror as if we were introducing our reflections to each other for the first time. We brushed our teeth with the rhythmic aesthetics of people who plan to share many mornings. The domesticity felt less like routine and more like liturgy. The apartment accepted us as if we had always been two inside it. We ate what could be called breakfast and also called sacrament, slices of bread warmed in a skillet, butter melting in pale rivers, a bowl of figs she halved with a small knife and placed on a plate between us, tear interiors blushing like something pleased to be seen. We ate with our knees touching under the tiny table, and every shared bite tasted like a simple promise. I found a napkin and wiped a smear of jam from her thumb as if writing my name there. She reached under the table and traced the line of my shin with her toes, and the tenderness of it rewrote a decade of guarded mornings. Work, hers, mine, waited the way faithful dogs wait, nearby, patient, sure of our return. We dressed without hurrying, pulling shirts over hair still tousled from sleep, stepping into jeans with the thoughtful balance of bodies that had learned a new weight and wanted to carry it well. I watched her slide her rings back on and felt the impulse to ask her to wear mine, though I had none to offer beyond the invisible band forming where her hand had rested over my heart. She found a tiny gold hoop on the floor, held it up to the light, and tucked it into a small dish, smiling in that way that says a life can be built around details. Before I left for my office, I wandered the studio with the confidence of someone who had crossed from visitor to inhabitant. I paused at the canvas that had blazed crimson and cobalt the night before and saw in it now a center softening, edges speaking to each other rather than competing. It looked like a conversation that had learned, finally, to allow silence. I pressed my palm lightly to my sternum as if to steady the recognition that rose there and thought that perhaps I, too, had softened at the center. Perhaps soft was not a weakness, but a door. At the threshold, I turned to her and felt the pull that doors have when they are both entrances and exits. My body remembered how to say what my mouth did not. I stepped close and placed my forehead against hers, let my breath brush her upper lip, let my hands ride the curve of her waist and settle. Her hands framed my face lightly, thumbs resting just under the bones as if reading for truth. We stood like that for a long beat that expanded into something clear. Then I kissed her with the kind of certainty that makes promises even when words don't follow. The kiss tasted like figs and heat and newness. It tasted like a name finally spoken aloud. I left with the quilt's imprint, still a faint grit on my cheek, and the slow burn of her fingertips lingering on my lower back like a small flame that would not be snuffed by distance or daylight. In the elevator, I watched the numbers descend and felt no sense of fall. The lobby received me, the street accepted me, the city moved around me with its usual insistence, and yet I had changed inside its permission. I carried her with me in the way my shoulders had relaxed, in the softened set of my jaw, in the steadier curve of my mouth. Even the way I measured space on the sidewalk adjusted to allow for an absent companion. I laughed under my breath at the tenderness of that reflex and did not apologize to the part of me that once would have. At my desk, the lines of a new project waited to be coaxed from imagination into structure. I traced the first arc, then the second, fingers sure on the page, and I realized I was designing with a new tolerance for asymmetry. A curve met a corner in a way I would previously have corrected, and I let the meeting stand because it looked like conversation instead of compromise. I could feel her influence not as invasion, but as expansion, my discipline wrapped around her improvisation the way an arm wraps a waist, each steadied by the other. My colleagues moved in their familiar orbits. My phone buzzed in its usual way. The office hummed. Beneath it, within me, a quieter hum held. I am loved. I have loved. I am not pretending. I checked the clock and felt nothing of the urgency that used to pace me like a metronome set too fast. Instead, I counted backward through the hours to the quilt, to the couch, to the moment my palm found the knot near her shoulder blade and pressed until she sighed. I promised myself I would learn all the knots and all the ways of easing them. I promised myself I would let her learn mine. I promised myself I would not rush the naming of what we had, but I would not hide from it either. Promises can be bones if you let them calcify wrongly. Promises can be breath if you invite them to move. I wanted ours to be breath. At lunch, I stepped outside to the small courtyard the building pretended was a garden and sat on a stone bench warmed by more than weather. I closed my eyes and felt again her thumb circling my wrist. The wave of pulse there quickened in greeting, then slowed in trust. I whispered, inside my own head, the truth I had only just begun to allow. I chose her. The words did not clang against any metal bars. They landed on something soft and generous and grew roots immediately. When the afternoon thinned into evening, I packed my bag with the same measured calm with which I had packed it the night before. I felt the pull toward her studio not as a compulsion, but as a homing instinct, an internal needle swinging toward a field it recognized. On the way out, I caught my reflection in the glass door and was briefly startled by the woman looking back, familiar and newly legible, the features reorganized by acceptance into a face that belonged to me first. I lifted my chin a fraction, an engineer's adjustment to a load newly distributed, and smiled with the audacity of someone learning to choose repeatedly. The city opened, as it always does, when a person walks through it knowing where she will be held. My stride sorted itself into a tempo my grandmother would have called womanly and my friends would have called confident, and I, for the first time, called mine. I thought of the quiet I would enter, the lamp made kinder by evening's dim, the scent of oil and citrus and her drawing breath. I thought of the quilt and the couch and the floor and the work table and the way every surface had agreed to become altar when we needed one. I thought of my family and felt the ache that any leaving carries and the relief that follows leaving done for love rather than escape. I thought of names, of the ones given and the ones chosen, and realized that love had indeed been learning mine, patiently, syllable by syllable, waiting for me to learn it too. I reached her building as the day folded itself neatly along its seams. My fingers found the familiar buzzer without looking, my body already rehearsed in this arriving. Somewhere inside, a set of keys would soon be set down, a shoe nudged aside, fabric whispering as a jacket surrendered an arm. Somewhere inside, light would find her face and my mouth would find the place beneath her ear that has already become my preferred address. Somewhere inside, we would build another small room from breath and touch and yes, and sleep would come when it was ready, and morning would rise from us rather than to us, and the day after would learn from both. I stepped through the door, into the stairwell, up the flight, hand on the rail worn smooth by years of comings and goings I had not witnessed. At the landing I paused long enough to feel gratitude move through me with the slow certainty of blood. Then I lifted my hand to knock, and, before my knuckles found wood, the handle turned from the other side, and the smile I had been practicing since noon met the smile she had been practicing since dawn. Love, having learned my name, spoke it back to me without sound. I answered with a kiss that tasted like the day's honest work and the night's honest rest, and the room gathered us the way a body gathers breath, and I understood I had only just begun. Morning crept into her studio through the wide glass panes, softened by sheer curtains that diffused the light into something that didn't demand attention. The world outside was already moving, but inside we lingered in the kind of stillness that made time bend. She lay on her stomach, the sheets slung low across her hips, her hair spilling over her bare shoulder in loose waves. I sat beside her with my knees drawn to my chest, tracing the faint pattern the quilt had left on her skin with my eyes. It was the first morning I allowed myself to look at her without apology. The air was warm and full of quiet, the gentle clicking of her ceiling fan, the muted creak of floorboards expanding. She stirred, her lashes fluttering open, and when her gaze met mine, I felt something shift, not a crash, not a revelation, but a quiet, irrevocable click. This was the moment I'd been building toward without realizing it, the space where love stops being something imagined and becomes something that requires consequence. We ate breakfast slowly, toasted bread, butter melting into golden pools, coffee brewed in her dented metal pot. She smeared a thumbprint of jam on my wrist absent-mindedly and laughed when I didn't move to wipe it away. I told myself the sound was just air and vibration, but my heart betrayed me, marking it as music. I watched her paint after we'd eaten, her body moving like a slow dance with the canvas. She worked barefoot, her toes smudged with cerulean from yesterday's palette, her back flexing under the loose white shirt she'd thrown on without buttoning completely. I knew then that my life before her was grayscale, functional, composed, and utterly starved of hue. But the more I let her world seep into mine, the more aware I became of how far it was from what my family would ever accept. It began as a whisper at the edges of thought, my mother's voice threaded through the quiet, soft but weighted. I could almost hear her saying how people talk, how choices echo, how reputations fracture like porcelain when you least expect them to. My father's face appeared next, the furrow between his brows that deepened whenever I strayed from what he called good sense. They'd built their lives around roles that disguised themselves as love, and I had followed them faithfully for most of mine. I remember the first time I'd hinted, gently, that perhaps I wasn't who they thought I was. My mother's hands had stilled over the dishes. She didn't look up. She'd only said, "You're just confused." My father had added, "Don't make things harder for yourself." I learned then that silence was a kind of obedience. Now, watching Lena move across her studio, the thought of returning to that silence filled me with nausea. When she finally stopped to stretch, the hem of her shirt lifted enough to expose the faintest line of her waist. She turned to me, smiled, and in that smile was every question I hadn't yet dared to ask. Could we live openly? Could we exist without lying? Could I bear the weight of the cost that love was quietly tallying between us? She crossed the room, bare feet padding against the wooden floor, and came to stand in front of me. She didn't speak. She never needed to. Her eyes found mine, and I felt the familiar current rise again, the gravity that always pulled us closer. I reached for her hand, my thumb brushing the inside of her wrist, feeling the faint, steady pulse beneath the surface. I wanted to freeze us there, in that suspended light, untouched by consequence. But life has a way of folding itself around truth, pressing until it leaves a mark. The first ripple came in the form of a text from my brother, short, almost careless. "Mom said you've been distant. Everything okay?" My hand tightened around my phone as if it could contain the flooded unleashed. I typed yes, just busy, and deleted it before sending. The lie tasted bitter. I looked up and found her watching me, her brow slightly furrowed, sensing the shift even before I could name it. I smiled weakly to reassure her. She didn't believe it, but she didn't push. She just came to sit beside me again, her thigh pressed against mine, grounding me in the present. That's what she always did, tethered me to the moment when my mind tried to escape to places of fear. Later that day, as I packed my things to leave for work, she caught my wrist and turned my palm over, studying it as though she could read the uncertainty etched into the lines. Then she lifted it to her lips and pressed a kiss into the center, warm, steady, wordless. That kiss haunted me through the day. During meetings, as I explained design plans to clients, her mouth on my skin kept replaying in the back of my mind, blurring the lines between focus and longing. I could feel her energy even through distance, as though she'd left a fingerprint on my pulse. It was only later that evening, sitting at my desk with the sun folding itself away, that the second ripple hit. My father's name lit up my phone. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but habit won. His voice was polite, careful, the way people speak when they're probing for truth they don't want to find. He asked about work, about my health, and then casually, deceptively mentioned that one of his friends had seen me near the art district last week with a girl who looked familiar. The pause after that sentence was long enough to build a bridge of dread between us. I said something neutral, something meaningless, but the damage was done. The line between my world with her and the world that had raised me had begun to thin, threads snapping one by one. That night, I returned to her studio under the weight of that fracture. The moment she opened the door, she knew. She always knew. I fell into her arms, my head resting against her shoulder, and she simply held me. Her hands moved in slow circles along my back, and her breath against my hair whispered patience, not pity. She led me to the couch, her movements unhurried, as if stillness could undo the unraveling inside me. When I finally looked up, her expression was calm, but her eyes carried questions, not of doubt, but of readiness. Could I fight for this? Would I? I didn't answer aloud. Instead, I leaned forward and kissed her hard, certain, desperate. The kind of kiss that asks for strength and gives it at once. Her hands came up to cradle my face, her thumbs brushing away the tremor in my jaw. The kiss deepened, softened, then deepened again, a conversation in rhythm, in breath, in surrender. We moved together slowly, as if the air had turned thick enough to sculpt around. My body learned hers again, mapping the familiar terrain with renewed purpose. Each touch felt like an oath, each sigh a confession. When she whispered against my neck, not words, but a sound that could have been my name, I felt something break open inside me. I stopped thinking about who might disapprove, who might leave, who might shame. In that moment, love became not defiance, but truth. When it was over, when we lay tangled in the dim afterglow, her fingers tracing idle circles on my stomach, I felt the ache of knowing what would come next. Love that asks for courage rarely arrives without consequence. But still, I knew I was already past the point of return. I had chosen her in every way that mattered. The only thing left was to say it out loud. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe to Sapphic Tales so you don't miss the next one. The days that followed unfolded with the deceptive calm that often precedes change. On the surface, everything carried on as before. I went to work, attended meetings, smiled at colleagues, and returned to Lena's studio in the evenings as if it were my second home. But beneath the rhythm of those days ran an undercurrent of tension, subtle but insistent, a hum I could no longer ignore. My family's silence was its own language, and I had learned to read it too well. My father's texts became shorter, My mother's calls more frequent, their small talk laced with questions I was expected not to notice. Are you eating well? You've sounded distracted lately. We miss you at Sunday dinners. Their words were kind, but behind them, I heard the tightening of invisible reins. Every time my phone lit up with their names, a heaviness filled my chest. I wanted to tell them the truth that I had found something real, something worth the risk, but the thought of their disappointment felt like standing at the edge of a long drop. So I did what I had always done. I delayed the fall. Lena never pressed. She had an intuitive sense for when silence was armor and when it was avoidance. Instead, she painted. Her art grew more abstract during that time, her canvases rippling with emotion that mirrored what I couldn't say aloud. I would watch her for hours, the sweep of her arm, the smear of pigment that became a confession in color. Sometimes she'd glance over at me with that knowing half-smile, and I'd realize she was painting what I felt but couldn't articulate. One evening, I sat at her work table sketching lines for a new project while she moved quietly behind me, her presence warm and grounding. She came to stand at my shoulder, and I felt her breath brush the back of my neck. My pencil stilled. I closed my eyes. Her hands found my shoulders, kneading the tension gathered there, her thumbs pressing slow, deliberate circles into muscle and memory alike. The small sound that escaped me wasn't words, just release. She leaned closer, her lips tracing a line along the curve of my jaw. I turned slightly, and our mouths met, soft at first, then deepening, unfolding like something that had always been waiting. The sketch beneath my hand smudged under the weight of our bodies leaning closer, graphite streaking the page like shadows trying to become form. When she finally pulled back, she rested her forehead against mine. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. The kiss had already said everything. I was hers, and she was mine, even if the world refused to name it that way. But love, when kept in secret, begins to thirst for air. It was a Thursday when everything began to unravel. I had left a presentation early to meet my parents for lunch, a ritual we maintained more out of habit than closeness. They chose a small restaurant uptown, quiet and tasteful, the kind of place where appearances mattered. My mother was already seated when I arrived, her posture perfect, her expression carefully composed. My father joined a few minutes later, his phone in hand, his eyes sharp. The conversation began politely enough, work updates, the weather, small talk that circled safely around the perimeter of truth. But then my father set his phone down and folded his hands, the gesture deliberate. "We heard from one of your colleagues," he said evenly. "You've been spending a lot of time in the art district." I froze mid-sip. The coffee in my cup suddenly tasted like metal. My mother's gaze softened in that way that wasn't really softness at all. It was pity wearing perfume. "We just want to make sure you're not being led astray," she said, her voice low. "You've worked so hard. Don't let someone take advantage of that." Someone. Not her. Not Lena. Just a cautionary ghost they could dismiss without name. The urge to defend her surged, but I swallowed it. Instead, I asked about work, about my brother's new house, about anything that would move us away from this precipice. They let me, but their eyes followed me like shadows that refused to leave. By the time I left, the air outside felt thin. I walked for nearly an hour before calling a cab, my thoughts looping in chaotic rhythm. I had always known this moment would come, the collision of who they thought I was and who I had become, but knowing didn't make it easier. When I reached Lena's door, she took one look at me and understood. She guided me inside, closed the door quietly, and wrapped her arms around me from behind. I turned into her without resistance, pressing my face against her neck, breathing in the familiar scent of turpentine and lavender. The closeness didn't erase the ache, but it made it bearable. That night, she painted while I lay on the couch watching her. The brush moved fast, almost violent, as if she was trying to pull the hurt out of me and lay it flat on canvas. When she finally stepped back, the painting was a blur of golds and blacks, a horizon caught between dusk and dawn. She looked at it for a long time, then at me, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say what we both knew, that the horizon wasn't outside, it was us. We were suspended between two worlds, and neither had room for the other. We went to bed without turning off the light. She curled into me, her fingers tracing idle lines on my chest, and whispered against my skin without sound. I closed my eyes and let her heartbeat echo against mine, wondering how long we could keep balancing between truth and the lives that didn't want it. Days turned to weeks. My parents stopped asking questions, but the silence that replaced them was worse. Invitations to family dinners came less often. My mother's texts dwindled to polite reminders about appointments or birthdays. When she did call, she never mentioned Lena, but her pauses carried the weight of what she refused to say. Meanwhile, Lena grew quieter too. She still painted, still touched me with tenderness that felt like prayer, but I could feel the distance she was trying not to create. She wanted me to choose her freely, not out of rebellion. But love and rebellion often live too close to tell apart. One night, as I watched her pack up her brushes, she caught me staring and smiled faintly. The kind of smile people wear when they're bracing for heartbreak but pretending it's weather. "Don't disappear," I wanted to tell her. But the words wouldn't come. I reached for her hand instead, holding it until my grip said what my voice couldn't. "I'm still here." But the truth was, I was beginning to fracture. Each night I spent with her, I felt more whole. Each morning I faced my family's silence. I felt myself splinter. I began to notice the smallest changes, my coworkers' sidelong glances when I mentioned the art district, my brother's sudden reluctance to invite me to gatherings, the shift in tone when family friends asked if I was seeing anyone. Whispers spread faster than courage, and I had no control over either. Yet through it all, Lena remained the one constant. Her steadiness, her humor, her quiet belief that love was worth whatever it demanded. And the more the world tightened around me, the more I understood that choosing her wasn't a single decision, it was 1,000 small ones, made every day in the spaces between fear and faith. One evening, as the city outside dimmed into soft light, she pulled me toward her with that familiar look that always undid me. The kiss that followed was deep, unhurried, aching with the weight of everything unsaid. My hands slid beneath her shirt, tracing the warm lines of her back. Her breath hitched against my mouth. She guided my hand lower, her body arching into mine, and in that moment all the noise, my parents, the silence, the judgment, fell away. There was only the sound of our breath, the pulse beneath our skin, the quiet knowing that love, no matter how forbidden, was still holy. We moved together until the air grew thick with heat and forgiveness, until the ache of fear melted into the hum of release. When we finally collapsed against each other, our limbs tangled, I realized that this simple, honest closeness was worth every exile. As she drifted into sleep beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, I stared at the ceiling and understood that the world would not make room for us. I would have to carve it myself. Just a quick pause. If you're enjoying this, hit that subscribe button and stay with us here on Sapphic Tales. It began with the sound of a knock that didn't belong in Lena's world. Firm, practiced, controlled, the kind of knock that belonged to my father. I froze mid-step, coffee mug halfway to my lips. She was standing by the window, sunlight cutting a halo around her, her face shifting as she realized something was wrong. I didn't have time to hide the signs, my jacket draped over her chair, my shoes kicked off near the door, a second toothbrush leaning in her cup like a confession. When I opened the door, the air left the room. My parents stood there, my mother immaculate, her expression a mask of quiet devastation, my father upright, eyes cold and assessing. Behind them, the hallway stretched like a tunnel, sterile and bright. For a moment, no one spoke. My father's gaze swept the room, cataloging the evidence of a life he didn't approve of. His jaw tightened. My mother's lips parted slightly as if to speak, but her voice broke before sound could form. The silence between us became unbearable, so I filled it. "You shouldn't be here," I said, though the words felt like they belonged to someone else. My father's eyes hardened. "We were worried," he said, his tone flat, deliberate. "Now I see why." Lena stepped forward, barefoot, her paint-streaked hands fidgeting at her sides. She looked at them, then at me, and I could see it, the quiet bravery in her stillness. She wasn't ashamed. She was waiting for me to match her courage. My mother's gaze flicked to Lena and then back to me, her eyes glossy. "Is this what you've been hiding?" she whispered. The word this struck sharper than it should have, slicing clean through the fragile calm I'd built. I wanted to explain, to soften the truth, to tell them it wasn't shame but survival that had kept me quiet. But when I looked at Lena, her steady posture, her unflinching gaze, I couldn't hide behind diplomacy anymore. "Yes," I said simply. The word was small, but it echoed like a cathedral bell. My mother covered her mouth with one hand. My father turned away, shaking his head, a quiet exhale escaping him like disappointment had finally found form. "You've embarrassed yourself," he muttered. "You've thrown everything away for he didn't finish. He didn't need to." The unspoken part hung between us like smoke. Lena stepped closer, her presence calm but unyielding. I reached for her hand instinctively, and that simple act, fingers threading together, broke the last thread of pretense. My mother's face crumpled. I had imagined this moment 100 times, but never how small it would feel. There was no shouting, no dramatic exit, only the dull ache of inevitability. My father straightened his coat, said something about giving me time to come to my senses, and walked out. My mother lingered just long enough to whisper my name, not as anger but as mourning. Then she followed him. When the door closed, the apartment fell silent again. I stood there, hand still in Lena's, the imprint of their presence lingering like smoke after a fire. She didn't speak. She just wrapped her arms around me from behind, pressing her cheek to the back of my neck. Her touch steadied the tremor in my chest, but nothing could erase the emptiness that had taken root there. We spent the rest of that day in half-light, moving through the apartment as if afraid sound would break something fragile. I made tea I didn't drink. She painted without color, her brush strokes wide and aimless. At dusk, I found her sitting on the floor, legs drawn up, her eyes distant. I knelt beside her, unsure what comfort was left to offer. When she finally looked at me, I saw guilt shadow her features, not because of what we were, but because of what it had cost. She reached out, her fingertips grazing my face, tracing the path of a tear I hadn't realized was falling. I leaned into her touch like a reflex. Her lips found mine, slow, searching, sorrowful. This kiss wasn't passion, it was communion. It was the way grief finds softness, the way love insists on existing even when everything around it demands silence. When she pulled me closer, I didn't resist. I needed her warmth like air. Our bodies moved without thought, seeking the comfort words couldn't provide. Her shirt slipped from her shoulders, and I pressed my mouth to the hollow of her throat, tasting salt and skin and something deeper, defiance wrapped in tenderness. We undressed each other in the dimness, every motion a quiet vow. When she guided me down beside her, I felt the weight of the world lift just enough for breath to return. Her hands mapped me like sacred ground, slow, reverent, remembering. I mirrored her, tracing every inch of her with gratitude, with ache, with need. When we came together, it was not a plea for escape, but an affirmation of survival. Her body against mine, her breath mingling with my name, everything narrowed to the rhythm of connection. It wasn't about rebellion anymore. It was about truth finding form through touch. When the wave crested, it was silent, deep, infinite. I felt her shudder beneath my hands, and I followed, unraveling into her until there was no separation left. After, we lay entwined in the quiet, the faint hum of the city beneath us. She rested her hand over my heart, and I covered it with mine. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to apologize for who I was. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe to Sapphic Tales so you don't miss the next one. But peace never lasts long when truth has been exposed. A week later, my brother showed up at my office. His face carried the exhaustion of someone caught between loyalty and expectation. He sat across from me, hands clasped, eyes soft. "They're worried," he said quietly. "Dad says you've chosen poorly." The word stung, though he didn't mean it cruelly. I didn't argue. I only asked if they were okay. He hesitated before saying, "They think you'll regret this." When he left, I stared at my reflection in the darkened window and saw a woman who had already made her choice and was still learning to live with the weight of it. That night, I told Lena everything. She listened, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she walked over, cupped my face, and kissed me again, not as comfort, but as understanding. That kiss said what words couldn't, that love worth fighting for doesn't ask to be easy. We didn't speak for a long time after that. Instead, we made love with the quiet urgency of people who know the world is trying to take something from them. Our rhythm was slow, reverent, aching, each touch deliberate, every sigh a form of resistance. As she moved against me, her skin slick and glowing in the half-light, I realized something profound. I wasn't losing a family. I was finding one. In her. In us. When we collapsed together, breaths tangled, hearts beating in sync, she whispered something against my shoulder that I didn't catch, but I felt its truth in the way she held me tighter afterward. Don't forget, every week we share new tales. Subscribe to Sapphic Tales so you're always the first to hear them. Don't forget, more stories like this are waiting. Subscribe now to Sapphic Tales before we continue. In the weeks that followed, the world rearranged itself in small, almost imperceptible ways. The calls from my family stopped altogether. The silence that once filled me with dread became a strange kind of companion, a quiet acknowledgement that I had stepped outside their story and begun writing my own. The first few days were hard. Grief has a way of arriving without announcement, finding you in the smallest details. I would reach for my phone to share a thought with my mother and remember she wasn't listening anymore. I would pass a bakery that reminded me of family mornings and feel the sting of nostalgia under my ribs. Yet even in that ache, there was relief, because for once, my sorrow was honest. Lena noticed everything. She didn't crowd me with comfort, she just stayed. When I sat on the floor, lost in thought, she would sit beside me without speaking. When I woke from dreams full of echoes, she would press her forehead to mine until my breath found rhythm again. She never tried to replace what I'd lost. She just reminded me that love wasn't subtraction, it was expansion. Her studio became our refuge, filled with the faint smell of turpentine and the hum of the city filtering through open windows. We lived simply, mornings spent in quiet companionship, afternoons painting or reading, evenings tangled in each other's warmth. Time softened around us, reshaping itself into something that felt real. I learned her patterns, how she hummed when she was focused, how she bit her lip when uncertain, how her laughter came low and unguarded when she was truly at ease. In her, I found not just passion but peace, the kind that settles deep into your bones. Sometimes she painted me. I would sit near the window while she studied me with that painter's gaze, equal parts devotion and analysis. Her eyes would trace me like she was memorizing not just my shape but my story. When she finished, she would never let me see the canvas immediately. She said art needed time to breathe before it revealed its truth. The first time she finally turned one toward me, I forgot how to speak. It wasn't a likeness in the traditional sense, not a portrait, but an emotion made visible. She had painted me surrounded by soft light, hands open, expression calm, as if I had just exhaled after years of holding my breath. Behind me, the faint outline of two figures faded into distance, not erased, just receding. I asked her what she'd meant it to be. She smiled and said, freedom. The word lodged somewhere deep in me, heavy and light at once. Weeks turned to months. The seasons shifted quietly, leaves fell, light changed, the air grew crisp and then soft again. My family's absence remained a shadow in the background, but it no longer ruled me. I had felt something steady in its place. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived in the mail. No name on the front, only my parents' address printed in familiar script. Inside was a single sheet, a photograph of the house I grew up in, my father standing beside the front gate, my mother seated on the porch. No note, no explanation, just an image frozen in time. For a long moment, I stared at it, unsure what to feel. Regret? Relief? The photograph carried everything they couldn't say. We're still here. You're still ours. But we don't know how to reach you. I showed it to Lena later that evening. She looked at it for a moment, then slid it into a drawer. You can love them, she said softly, without living for them. That night, we lay in bed facing each other, our legs tangled beneath the sheets. She traced the outline of my face with one finger, slow and tender, as if committing it to memory. I felt the warmth of her hand, the steady beat of her pulse through her palm, and realized how far I had come from the girl who feared rejection to the woman who could stand in truth without apology. Our bodies found each other again, unhurried and deliberate, every touch a promise renewed. Her hands moved along my spine, gentle but insistent, coaxing every remnant of hesitation from me. I mirrored her rhythm, my palms exploring the familiar terrain of her skin, the small scar near her ribs, the faint freckles on her shoulder, the heartbeat I could feel under her collarbone. The world beyond those walls didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this, the way our breaths synced, the way our whispers became language, the way her body fit perfectly against mine, as if molded by the same longing. When she arched beneath me, a soft sound escaping her lips, I understood that love was not defiance anymore. It was peace. Afterward, we lay still, the room glowing faintly in the light of the setting sun. Her head rested on my chest, her fingers absently tracing shapes on my skin. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of her solid, grounding, real. We talked about the future sometimes, not in grand plans, but in simple dreams. A bigger studio with better light. A cabin near the coast. Maybe adopting a dog. There was no urgency in our plans, only the quiet joy of possibility. I didn't know if my parents would ever come around. Maybe they wouldn't. But love, I'd learned, doesn't always need reconciliation to be complete. Sometimes it just needs space to grow, to breathe, to exist without apology. Months later, at one of Lena's gallery openings, I stood beside her as people admired her work. She introduced me simply as her partner, and no one flinched, no one whispered. For the first time, I realized how small the world of judgment really was, and how vast love could be when you stopped hiding it. When the night ended and the crowd dispersed, we walked home under the soft glow of streetlights. She reached for my hand without hesitation, and I didn't pull away. Not anymore. At the crosswalk, I caught our reflection in a storefront window, two women walking side by side, shoulders brushing, eyes steady. I didn't see rebellion or shame or exile. I saw belonging. I saw home. If it kept you hooked, subscribe now to Sapphic Tales so you never miss the next. We reached the corner where the light turned green, and she looked at me with that smile I'd come to know quiet, knowing infinite. I squeezed her hand, and we stepped forward together into a world that finally felt like ours.